Welcome everyone to Ghost Stories Make the Campfire Memorable, and this is actually not that much about ghost stories. It's really about museums and historical attractions and sites. But it just goes to the power of storytelling. So I'm going to dig right in, and there are many challenges when we talk about local museums. First of all, the average museum visit is just 20 minutes. I mean, I can stand in a local museum in one spot for 20 minutes and look at things, but what happens is people just kind of, they look at this, they just kind of wander around, look at a few things, and then they're out the door. And rarely are they a primary attraction. Typically, we come to destinations for one reason, and then while we're there, what else do you have to offer? And that's a complementary activity, and that's where museums usually are. Even in Washington, D.C., the collection of Smithsonian museums, 85% of the people that go to a Smithsonian museum are in Washington, D.C. for other reasons, but while they're there, these are a must-see activity. So that is part of the challenge. And then typically there have been there, done that activity. You do it once, you've seen it, why come back? And here's another challenge. They're poorly funded, barely supported locally, because even locals say, oh yeah, I went there once. Or I had relatives come in and I went there, but been there, done that. The other perception you have is that they only cater to old people. And another perception is that they tend to be boring and that they never change. So, how do you like that for a start for talking about museums and historical sites and attractions? But on the bright side, they can get people to stop while passing through. If you've got something, they say, well, you know what, while we're going by, we should stop and see this. It's pretty cool. And here's the other thing, is if you can captivate the visitor for 2 hours, not just 20 minutes, 2 hours, spending will double. So with those negative perceptions, I want to spend the next little bit of time with you changing that. And so I want to show you a few of my favorite museums and what they did and why they're my favorite. And by the way, every one of these you're going to see was an ultra memorable experience. I'll never forget it. And by the way, I've been in thousands, literally thousands of local museums. And almost all of these were located in smaller cities and towns. And then all of them were working on a very small or a very tight budget. I mean, even the Smithsonian is constantly working on fundraising. And I focused on museums that were not dedicated to individual famous people or national events like 9/11 Memorial and I've been in, the Johnny Carson and Donna Reed and many famous people, but many communities don't have those. So I want to talk about just general purpose historical museums. So first up is the Orphan Train Museum in Concordia, Kansas. Now, I had heard of the Orphan Train, but I knew nothing about it. And we were secret shopping Concordia. Our assessment program is our most popular program. And when we were walking around downtown, I saw this sign that says National Orphan Train Museum. I said, well, I guess we should probably check that out. So we went over and found it, and you could see there is a research center on the left, and the museum is off to the right. And so when we pulled in the parking lot, the first thing that caught our attention were these bronze statues of these children. You can see her with the ice cream cone and the balloons, or this one here. And so it was starting to evoke emotion before we even stepped inside. And this used to be a train depot. It's a very modest building. It's run by volunteers, and when you go inside, it's not this big, huge museum. It's just this small train depot. A lot of the displays are on easels, but they did some things that are really, really cool. The first thing they did is they used large type and large photographs. And I'm going to talk about this. But just to give you some idea about this museum, this is back at the turn of the 1900, actually about 1873 on. 30,000 kids were living on the streets in New York City. And so a gentleman wanted to send them to farms in the Midwest because they were short on workers. And then they thought these had good American ideals. And, but they would be part of family. So they put about 10 to 30 children on each train. You could request in advance by letter a certain type of child. Oh, I want a curly-haired blonde girl that's between 5 and 10 years old, or, so they could do that. Or you could have them come in, they'd step off the train, and I'll show you that in a minute, and pick out your child. And for a lot of you, you're going, oh my gosh, really? You can see here it ran for, roughly 75 years, and 250,000 children were sent to families around the United States. And 1 in 25 people in the U.S. have a connection to an orphan-trained child. So, out of this, and if you notice that photos on the left, you'll see these little kids on the streets in New York. And notice the sign on the left. It's big text. You can read it. You can have 3 or 4 or 5 people standing there. And when the photos are large like this, it really brings it to life. So the first tip is use large photographs. You can go to Staples, Office Max, a local landscape architect. They all have large format printers, and a lot of times they'll donate getting these photographs enlarged for you. You give them to them on a disc. Make sure you get as high a resolution one as you can, and then mount them on what we call gator board. There's foam core board that you hear a lot that we put photographs on. Gator board doesn't warp. So in some of the older museums and everything, you don't want those to warp. So gator board works really good, 1/4 inch or so. But when you have photographs like that, it really makes an impact. This is a typical lineup. So they would get the kids off the train and they would line them up by their height, and people would go down and pick out their kids. I mean, it's really kind of a sad state, but it was kind of the precursor to the welfare or the foster child system. Now, one thing that was really important is they talked about the unrestricted immigration. By the way, this is not a political statement, but how many people were coming into New York City and they flooded in, and then some of them would die or they would be impoverished and the kids would end up on the streets. A lot of moms died at childbirth, and so it was a major, major issue. And look, they do this really easy in this one poster. And what happens is Charles Loring Brace, that started the Children's Aid Society, you can just walk down the wall. This is one of the very few museums I have ever visited where I read all of the text. I didn't just look at things, I read the text. And by the way, all the whole museum is this. So there's not artifacts and those kinds of things. And so they do a great job of telling the story with large photos. You can see the size of the photo next to the bench there, and how they would place these children out there. And they even did a cool thing where they would take photographs like this, and they actually had them printed on like fabric, and they put them in front of the windows. And if there's any kind of a breeze, they kind of waffle almost like a ghostly image. It was just a really cool way to take your windows without making too much light in there, and actually illuminating the photos of these kids that were printed on this fabric. And what's really cool, you can see a little sign off to the left. If you wanted to know details about that particular girl, then you could right here. And what happened is the bigger posters were enough that we wanted to hear about the individuals. And they talked about Yetta, when she was on an orphan train, and clear up until she passed away or retired, and they did that with many of these. So out of the rules I want to give you, you got that first tip, but the very first thing that is so important is you must evoke emotion. Seeing collections of typewriters and dental chairs is not evoking emotion. And so it can be scandalous, notorious, funny, jaw-dropping, scary, weird, almost unbelievable, or experiential. And I'm going to give you others. But when you talk about evoking emotion, I'm going to read you just one paragraph. People expect more of an orphan child than they do of their own. The faults seem greater, are magnified greater. I was sent to take away a boy for the awful crime of going in the cellar and sticking his fingers in some jelly. Would they send away their own child for that? When I read that, I sat there and I was like, oh my God. It was very, very emotional. And another cool thing they do is you saw these around the museum. It'd be great if you added a hashtag or whatever to make it easy for them. But that brings us to tip number 2. You need to encourage your visitors to share the experience. A lot of museums say you can't even take photographs. Just say no flash photographs. You want people to share their experience on Facebook, on Instagram, on TripAdvisor particularly. You could even say you need to text your friends and talk about this. So at the Orphan Train Museum, they had several of these around the museum. But what you could do is just use a hashtag or so they get it. So it's the Orphan Train Complex, the Orphan Train Museum. You don't want a whole bunch of different reviews for, so people are confused. So if they just create a hashtag Orphan Train Museum and put that on there and then did Facebook, Instagram, and actually list and encourage people to do that. Number 3. The other thing that museums need to do is take it out of the museum and spread it through town. So in Concordia, Kansas, they had this beautiful little park in the middle of their downtown. I thought, wouldn't it be cool if they had one of those bronze child statues there and an interpretive sign that talked about the Orphan Train Museum? So that if we're in Concordia for another reason and we stepped into this little park, it would educate us that there is the Orphan Train Museum if we missed a sign or something. And it also reminds your locals and the people here of what you have. And if they did that all throughout town, those bronze sculptures or just little stories of the orphans, then I think they could really, really make it more than just a complimentary activity, but a primary draw. And so the bottom line is with every single good museum, they evoke emotion. It's not just stuff. We were in Nova Scotia and we went into the Springhill Miners Museum. Now, there's lots of mining museums, but what's really cool about this, we all put on our yellow jackets. We had to wear our hard hats. The gentleman you see off to the right is a miner that actually worked in this mine. And what they do is they take you down into the mine where you're hunched over. And you'll go down in the mine, even a couple 100 feet or, 20 meters, whatever. And you'll go down there and say, okay, everybody hold still. And they will turn off the lights or the flashlights, and you cannot see a thing. I mean, it is pitch black, even after you try to adjust your eyes. And if you kind of walk hunched over, you can't tell whether you're going up or down. I mean, it was an eerie sense, and you just go, oh my gosh. And then after about 10 minutes of doing this, your back starts to hurt. And these people were in there for 8, 10, 12, 14 hours a day. So it was really, in this case, even though the museum had a lot of displays about mining, this was the part that was so memorable because it evokes emotion. Can you imagine what happened if your light goes out? I mean, you can't hardly even feel the walls, let alone, you would think that, just work your way uphill. That'll take you out. But you know what? It's almost impossible to tell whether you're going up or down. The next one I want to show you is the Hearts Veterans Museum. And Hearts is helping every American remember through serving. That's what that stands for. It's in Huntsville, Texas. It's about an hour and a half away from Houston. So I wanted to show you these that are not right in the urban cores or that close. Now, when I saw this, it was first in a mall. So this is where it started. In a mall, they had an empty retail space. The mall owner said, sure, you can put a museum. And I thought, okay, I'm going to go in there and I'm going to see just a collection of war artifacts, which I've seen hundreds of times. But what was interesting is I had just seen the movie Saving Private Ryan. And they say the first 20 minutes of that movie is some of the best in cinematography or in cinema history. But when I went in there, an interesting thing happened is they had these 10-foot wide booths that actually had a veteran there telling his or her story. This is a guy named Michael Camella that was on Omaha Beach that day. And I wish I had time to tell you the story, but he enlisted when he was 17 with his best friend, and he was at Omaha Beach, and him and his best friend standing next to each other on a one of these small boats, a landing raft, and they let the gate down into the water, and his friend got shot. And so he jumped off of that into 45-degree water for you in Celsius. It's barely above freezing. They wore so much gear that they sank to the bottom. And all I remember is he thought I was going to drown. He could hear the bullets going by him underwater. And he said a prayer to God to please deliver him. And he pulled his buddy up on the shore, laid him down, and he'd been shot through the head while he was underwater. I always have a hard time telling that story, but I will never, ever forget Michael Camella telling that story. It brought it to life. You know, he passed away a couple of years ago, and I said, boy, you got to get these veterans on film. But talk about evoking emotion. See the little book down there on there? He actually sent it to me. I went back there and told him that I wanted to tell his story. So he sent me this. He even circled him. That's him right there. And so he sent this to me. And I'll tell you, I will never, ever, ever forget Michael Camella. And so when you can do that, it can be awesome. Now, they have since moved into a bigger standalone museum. But it's such an incredible premise. They had soldiers from the U.S., Canada, Great Britain, Australia would come in, and they would say, look, here's your booth for 3 weeks. You can decorate it how you want. And they might be, World War II. There's very few left. Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, you name it. And they'll spend 2 or 3 weeks to tell their story. And a lot of them had to be talked into it because they're a little embarrassed. And you know what the museum did? And volunteers helped cover their costs. The hotels put them up, and even restaurants fed them. It was amazing. This whole thing started by having these people go visit local schools. But what's interesting is by doing this, you change it up. So they're there for 3 weeks. So people are always going back because now they can meet a soldier that fought in Iraq or in Afghanistan or in Korea and each has their story. And so that changes it up, and it is very, very powerful. Now, for you that don't have the people or a focus like military, just have like 200 exhibits. I've been in hundreds of museums that have thousands of artifacts, and you just walk by them all. And so it would be better if you had fewer exhibits and told a stronger story. So with every museum, big or small, I would really recommend you change it every 3 months. I mean, if you did it every month, people would be there every single month. And I'm going to show you an example. In Concordia, Kansas, where the Orphan Train Museum, there's also the County Museum. And by the way, county museums, I see these everywhere. It means nothing. It could be Life on the Prairie Museum. Give it something other than the name of your city or your county. But this is a beautifully done museum. Look at this full-size plane, a covered wagon down below. They've got tons of stuff in there. But that is the problem. I think it would be better if they put 3/4 of the stuff, the artifacts, in a warehouse or somewhere else, and take all these tractors and spread them out. Because I don't know when these were used. I don't know how they were used. I don't know. All they are is collections of stuff. There's no context at all. So I thought, what if you did a 3-month exhibit, farming on the Great Plains? And here's how they did it in the early 1800s, in the mid 1800s, in the early 1900s. And then we had motorized tractors. And you move these around and you could put them by decade and tell us what it was like to farm. You could even, this was horse drawn and it would take 6 hours to plow under 1 acre and, pull us in. This is in the same museum. Wouldn't it be cool? He said, here is life on the prairie, and here's how a butter churn worked, or a cider press, or here's how a wringer washing machine worked. You could actually have somebody running a wringer washing machine, volunteer, so they could see this is how they did clothes, or even the way of ice boxes. But instead, what we have is just pile stuff. So you could take the tractors out, and for the next 3 months, you could do, here's what life on the prairie was like. Here's a guy making a broom, but all there is a little teeny display with hard to read text. See it right down there in the middle. And a mannequin, but if you said, well, here's how we made things on the prairie, and you just limited what you put on display and then just change it up. This is what they do in car museums to bring people back. Even Smithsonian has rotating exhibits. They even have traveling exhibits. But in this museum, there was like this little doll. It just said who donated. I have no idea how old it is. Maybe it took somebody a month of wages to be able to purchase this for their child. I don't know. There's no context. So you could even do for 3 months just toys that were used and put them by period or time or whatever. And I think that would be so good to do, to change it up and keep people bringing back, and you'll see your revenues increase. I know it's a lot of work, but that's how you go from being a been there, done that, to we got to go back and see what's new. The Ross Farm, which is in central Nova Scotia, is one of my favorite. And this one is an actual farm museum, but they actually work the farm. You can see in this picture on their website, Nothing But the Flax, February 10th and 11th. They actually have people coming, volunteers coming in there and showing you how things work. And what's really cool is it can change. So sometimes you'll see how they actually made casks, like you see in this photo. You can go in there and actually card wool to know what that is. Candle making, woodworking, food preparation, and they're always changing it up. So there's always incentive to go back. And this brings in school kids, it brings in families, and they'll stay for hours. And number 6 is we love a good story. And it is the heart and soul of all of these. It can be sad, heartbreaking, humorous, tragic, uplifting. I mean, you name it. We love stories. One of my favorite museums that I've ever been in is in Northeastern Nevada in Elko. They're more than 3 hours away from Salt Lake City and like 5 hours away from Reno. Now, the first thing I said is, you have white letters on a white building. And I told them that in the next week, they painted them black. So now all of a sudden they stood out. Now this is part historical museum and part wildlife wing. When I went in, it was like $6 and they gave me a receipt and said, by the way, this receipt is good for all day. And I thought to myself, oh yeah, right, 20 minutes. Why would I ever come back? Well, I went in and when I went into the wildlife wing, they didn't just show stuffed animals, they actually showed how a lion kills a wildebeest. I mean, they told the story of what it was like on the Sahara, in Africa, how these animals survived. And I'm telling you, I was there for like 2.5 hours in the wildlife wing. I left to go get lunch. That's additional spending. And then I came back and went in the historical wing. And they would have little things like this is Lansford Hastings was a self-proclaimed expert on westward migration. He recruited immigrants to take his cutoff by promoting it as a shorter and better way to California, but it was neither. And this talks about the famous Donner Party that ended up with a little bit of cannibalism to stay alive. And they tell that story. But notice it's easy to read. It's not small type. But they do a good job. These are branding irons. But rather than say, here are branding irons, they talk in the West, marking a beef with a red-hot iron is like placing a 4-footed stake under lock and key. The brand shows legal ownership. And it says, occasionally a career in the cattle business was launched by illegally altering a brand. But the rustler shenanigans usually were halted at the end of a swinging rope. See what I mean? And one of my favorite stories they talk about is a guy of a ranch that was missing their cattle, but they couldn't find, somebody was rustling cattle, but they couldn't find any human footprints. So one day the ranchers were following some cattle footprints, and they went over a hill and down this valley, and there they saw some guy herding a couple of their cattle. And they went and caught up with him. And there he was, Crazy Hex Hazelwood, wearing these shoes he crafted so they wouldn't see the human footprints. See, and notice it says, where's the beef? When you tell interesting, fascinating stories, and every town has a cool story, and it doesn't always have to be funny, but this one is fascinating. It pulls us in. You need a good title. If I go back to that, it says, where's the beef? That's enough to pull us in. And then if you have a good title and then 100 words or less, readable from a distance, it will make all the difference in the world. So you know what I did? I took that, where's the beef, and I printed it out on 11 by 17. And I took this at my house. And by the way, you can see there's a piece of Native American art I got in Terrace, British Columbia. And off to the right, I just stuck that there. It does not go. But I just want to show you that that's 11 by 17 piece of paper. I just put that next to the print, and I stood back on the other side of the room, and I could still read it. And if there was a good photograph or a display there, it's going to pull me right to it. That's 11 by 17. So any printer could do 11 by 17. But even if you just do it 8.5 by 11, but use larger type and a good title, it will pull us to the display. So I took that 11 by 17 and 8.5 by 11, and then here's another display in our house. You can tell we collect Native American or First Nations art. Once again, you could read this from quite a ways away. And so here's the point with this. First of all, when you do these little displays, use Helvetica Bold for the title. Helvetica is the font that's easiest to read. And that there is like 60 point type on 11 by 17. And then the body text is 30 point. And then what I tell people, there it is, 11 by 17, is if you can do it in 100 words or less, that would be great. Now this one here is almost 200 words. But it is such a good story that if we just read, for a few months in the late 1920s, cows were rustled on the large UC ranch in northern Elko County, and no human tracks were found at the scene of the crimes. It had ranchers scratching their heads in bewilderment. If you can pull me in the first paragraph, then I will read another 150 words. But if your museums just did this next to their displays, you would keep people longer, they would come back, and they would be fascinated by the stories. And here it is with just 8.5 by 11 next to this display. Okay? So now, always tell great stories. They could be sad, just like I said. They could be funny, like you did here. I was in the Oregon Trail Museum, which is one of my favorite. And this is in Baker City, Oregon. 300,000 people went 2,000 miles. And the one thing I remember is that of all these people, about 30,000 of them died. That's equivalent to a death every 350 feet of 2,000 miles, not kilometers. Just that fact alone is an OMG moment. It just hits an emotional chord of what these people went through. In Cody, Wyoming, they've got a great museum. This is the National Historic Trails Interpretive Center in Casper. Sorry, not Cody. What's cool about this is you can step into this wagon and it actually has a screen in front of the wagon that shows you crossing the river, and the wagon just jolts as it hits rocks. And what happened is you ride in that wagon for 5 minutes, and then you understand why people preferred to walk in bare feet in the snow with blisters or with holes in the bottoms of their shoes, if they even own shoes, than ride in these and take the jolting experience of this. It just jars you to the bone. So when people can be immersed in the story, they will never forget you, your museum, or what it was like. You know, another one of my favorites, this is in a little bigger city, Plymouth, Massachusetts. This is Plymouth Plantation, and yes, that's how they spelled it back then. And what happens is once you go in here and you go past the interpretive center, you will walk down into this. And they actually have actors down there, and they are in period. They actually are making bread, they are farming, they are doing everything the Pilgrims did, the early settlers in the United States, like 1650s. And what's interesting that where the clothes and everything, and I'll never forget that I walked up to somebody here and said, you know, can you tell me where the bathrooms are? And they said, sir, are you in need of a bath? And I said, well, how about a restroom? Are you in need of a rest? I mean, he knew good and well what I was looking for, but they would not break character. And so when schools, when families come in here, number one, you could spend 4 or 5 hours here. And we walked into one house where they were actually saying a prayer and breaking bread. I mean, they're just living it, and you just kind of eavesdrop on them. It was fascinating. And I would go back there 3 times a year if I lived close enough. And so that's by making it experiential, and they just transport us. So if you can do this, if you can transport us to another place or back in time, because once you're on this set, it was amazing. Okay? Always transports. And I'm going to get a little more into that. And then narrow your focus. Be known for something specific. One of the museums I have not seen, and I will make a special trip for it, is the International Spy Museum. You know, this is in Virginia, if I remember right, and it is amazing, and it's assume nothing. The magic of spying, tradecraft trickery, saboteurs. I mean, they even have a spy camp for kids. You know, I just think when you have a focus like that, all of a sudden people are going to come way out of their way to see you and your museum. So it could be a Life on the Prairie Museum, or life in the Rocky Mountains, or a life along the coast. It might be a focus. You might have exhibits by decade. Rather than just have stuff all put together, you could have them by decade, 1750, 1775, and you actually put them in order so you can kind of walk through history. Rather than just say, here's a whole bunch of typewriters, you actually put them in there. Or, you know what, if it's a little newer, you can even do it by decade. Life in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, even into the future. So imagine this. If you could create a little kitchen set or a family room, and you go find, put them by decades, you could do period appliances in that little room. And it doesn't have to be even full size. You put in some period furnishings, and then you might have a desk with that period typewriter on it. And you might put some National Geographic or Life magazines or even a Sears catalog from the late 1800s out on a table, so that all of a sudden we're looking at a set and we're just transported back in time. And, you might even have period dishes, cooking utensils. I mean, art on the wall from the period. Maybe shoes and clothing, whether it's on a mannequin or whether it is, they have a coat draped over the back of a chair. You might have that television set there, or the old-fashioned radio. Maybe there's a period newspaper sitting on the counter. Maybe there's a few popular toys, but you could just do one little room like this, and it would make all the difference in the world. So when you narrow your focus, you could do through the ages. You could do prehistoric, early humans, early American, the Native Americans, First Nations people, and then modern times, these centuries. You could even do one on the future. Here's one in Blanding, Utah, which is in San Juan County near Monument Valley, population 4,000, and they're a 3-hour drive from Grand Junction, Colorado, and it's a dinosaur museum. Now, there's lots of dinosaur museums. What's cool about this one is this little dinosaur you're seeing right here is actually about 3 inches tall. But what they do is they create these little miniature sets for movie making, and you actually sit there and look through the lens of a camera, and all of a sudden you can see how he looks like he could be 10, 20 feet tall. So what they did cool in this one is they didn't just do everything authentic dinosaurs, they even did mythical dinosaurs. And notice the posters, they're all from famous dinosaur movies from around the world. See what I mean? So it doesn't always have to be paleontology. In fact, it can be fiction. You know, the Godzilla and those things. They do have some real dinosaurs there, you know, or replicas, but what's so cool about this was all those old posters. I spent an hour and a half there looking at all the old posters and all the old creatures. Some of them they actually used on sets for movies. It made them different from every single dinosaur museum I've seen. And you know, another one is talk about dinosaurs is in Vernal, Utah. When you come over the Colorado border into northeastern Utah, it says, welcome you to a life elevated, and that's what they show. Remember what I said, bring it around town? When you come into Vernal, these are the billboards. These are the entrances you see. And even their tourism is all about dinosaur land. You know, you'll want to stay forever. The dinosaurs did. And what they have there is the Dinosaur National Monument. Now, this is a national monument, so it doesn't really fit in our local museums. But notice, this is like a mile or so away from it. But this place is famous for the Wall of Bones. This wall right there, you know what? We never see bones sitting in there where they were actually found. Usually they carve them up and they put them together and then you see them on display. This whole hillside actually heaved up over time and it started to wash away, and all these bones you see there are sitting where they've been for millions and millions of years. I mean, you can see this, and there's no museum like this anywhere. It was incredible seeing it. Like here's a whole backbone of a dinosaur. And yes, they will show you the bones right here and then what it looked like, you know, in flesh. And what they do is you're allowed to touch them. Touch real dinosaur bones. And of course, they have like a shellac varnish or something over them. That's Jane there. And so being able to do that, you'll never forget. And even their visitor's guide is the Wall of Bones. So some ideas on finding your focus. It could be movies and posters. It doesn't have to be dinosaur movies, by the way. You could do a museum that's focused on any of these things. And then you can say, while you're here, here's some things of our local history. And so if you just, and by the way, almost every single one of these was founded on a minuscule budget. The difference between the successful museums that become an attraction and a local museum is that they've narrowed their focus, they limit the number of displays, and they change them up. This is the Music Instrument Museum in Phoenix, Arizona. Yes, bigger city, bigger museum, but it's really fascinating. You can go in there and play them and try them. I mean, in Baraboo, Wisconsin, they have the Circus World Museum. It's incredible. It has a focus, and it's amazing the stuff they have in there. And so these are things that really can make you a draw. Another one we were in is Luverne, Minnesota. In this small little town, they took an old auto dealership. They were just setting it all up when we got there. And a single woman named Betty has been collecting nutcrackers for years and years and years. And she has one of the most amazing displays of nutcrackers I've ever seen. I mean, you could spend all day in there, and it's not just about Christmas. And they come from all over the world. And here she is talking to Jane about her collection. And the town said, why don't we create a museum for you? She had them in her house. She had them in boxes. And it's so cool. People are donating them. You know, I mean, some of them are really cool. That's actually a nutcracker. We even thought, wouldn't it be cool if you did a Where's Waldo nutcracker and you put it somewhere in here and you'd have people looking through thousands of nutcrackers trying to find Where's Waldo. It would keep them for hours. And then, of course, they've got the gift shop that has nutcrackers and other gifts. And, you know, this is the billboard when you come into Luverne. And I said, why should we take the next exit and, you know, discover? And so we thought, what if you change that? See what I mean? And that is how you pull people in, a narrow focus, something totally different. Another good example is in Judique, which is on Cape Breton Island in Nova Scotia, a little town off the Cabot Trail, and they have the Celtic Music Interpretive Center. What's really cool is they have a little restaurant in there, and when you go in there and eat lunch, you can also be there attending a ceilidh. And that's what this is. This is where people come in with fiddles and stuff, so you're actually living it. And they might do that on just Thursdays and Fridays and Saturdays at lunchtime, or maybe once at dinner. They've got great displays, but the highlight is that they actually have films. Here's Jane trying to learn how to step dance. So you can actually try it. And they'll tell you, here's how you take your step. Here's how you take your step back. You're on a wooden floor there. And so you'll actually spend time. You can play it, back play it. You can slow it down and try to learn how hard it is to do step dancing. And they even have fiddles. You can take a fiddle off the wall and just try to play it. See, so what they did is took this music, they made it experiential, and they'll tell you how a violin, why it makes the great sound it does. All of these are experiential and have a focus. This is the High Desert Museum, which is the most visited museum in the state of Oregon, one of the most visited attractions. And they have wild animals, they have mining, but it's all about the high desert where wild meets west. And so number 9. So that's having your focus. That's number 8. So number 9 is marketing. I want you to avoid these words: collections, artifacts, exhibits, and donated by. You can put donated by, but sometimes, you know what? We don't know who you are. We don't know who's donating these. But when you say artifact, oh, come and see our collection of typewriters. Let's see, we have many, many artifacts. We have thousands of artifacts. We have hundreds of exhibits. You know what we do? We start yawning. I'm sorry. And so, some museums worth a special trip: the Orphan Train Museum, the Plymouth Plantation, Dinosaur National Monument, Northeastern Nevada, the Celtic Museum, Oregon Trail Interpretive Center, the High Desert Museum. And this doesn't include the biggies like Smithsonian, the Experience Music Project in Seattle, car museums, which I love, and they always change those out. The Experimental Aircraft Association, EAA Museum in Oshkosh, Wisconsin, the Museum of Flight, Biltmore Estate in Asheville, North Carolina. I did not include in this list, natural disasters like the Frank Slide in western Alberta, or head smashed in Buffalo Jump in Alberta, which, by the way, just the name makes you want to go there. And there are many other great museums I've visited. So in a nutshell, to wrap it up, you need to evoke emotion. Encourage visitors to share the experience. Spread the stories throughout your town. Change it up. Don't be a been there, done that. Pull us into your displays. And we love a good story. If you have a good story, I can't believe the number of people that go visit friends and family in Elko, they take them down just to read the story of Crazy Tex Hazelwood. We love a good story. Transport us into the story, back in time, and then narrow your focus. And then avoid those boring words. If you can do these things, you will take a small museum that's really struggling. You will make it a major attraction. The revenues will come in. The donations and everything will come in. And it works. And then finally, number 10, pass this on. Work with you museums. Help them grow. And just tell them, if we can get 2 people to spend time in your town, even if they're just driving by and stop, spending doubles. And that is it for this one. I mean, and people always say, I always say, you can't place your brand on history. And the reason I say that is because most of it's been there, done that. But if you can keep changing things up, I know it takes a lot of work, but what will happen is the revenues will start coming up. People that come in once a year when you do an open house will all of a sudden come in every 3 months because you got something new. And then you just tell 2 or 3 stories even. Personal stories. These people don't have to be famous. Michael Comello wasn't famous. Crazy Textiles Award isn't famous. You just need to tell stories where they're humorous, sad, what they did, how it was like. Even picking up old irons, the way they used to iron clothes. I mean, you lift one of those up and try to hold it in your hand for 30 seconds. Your hand starts shaking. It's so heavy. Let people do that. So with that, thank you so much for attending. Thank you very much.